First of all, I just want to say thanks to ILTA for inviting me. The real reason I'm here is because Paul and I are Clash fans. So if you like this talk, you can thank Joe Strummer. If you don't like it, blame blame someone else. Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk about navigating the open educational landscape. I'm getting a bit of an echo of my own voice, which is quite tricky to talk through. So anyway, so I'm going to cover kind of 4 themes. And the first is, why is it important? Why should you care about open education? The second is, what do we mean by it? And I'll talk about some work we've done there. And then I'm going to look at some of the impacts of open education and some of the issues arising from it. And lastly, think about where it's heading. So the first of those is why. So why is it important? So I think you can look at this from a number of kind of angles which are kind of related to demographics and global shifts and those kind of things. So you've probably all seen these kind of predictions that in order to accommodate growing demand for higher education, we'd need to build a new university every week or something. So the British Council predict that there's going to be another 21 million higher education places globally by 2020. And another study's put it at 100 million extra places by 2025, particularly seeing growth in places like India, Brazil, Indonesia. So it's unlikely that kind of existing infrastructure is going to be able to deal with that expansion. But also the type of people coming into that education may not be well suited, they might not be able to afford the kind of current models, or they might need to work and accommodate it within kind of different lifestyles. So our current model may not be suitable for the growing expansion. And related to that, I think in the US, for the first time ever, the kind of typical student, 18 to 22-year-old, on campus full-time, is no longer the majority. So people are generally older, often studying part-time, blended maybe, and those people have kind of different demands from higher education. And if you think about the needs of the digital economy, so we're seeing kind of growth in different types of areas, whether that's developing apps or just even with any kind of job, you can develop digital skills. So I live in Wales, a digital curriculum which kind of embeds these skills across all topics. But also just more generally for society, you know, I'm going to say fake news, and we live in this world of like fake news, trolls, Russian bots, kind of knowing how to deal with that kind of stuff and developing the skills to deal with that, I think is kind of very important social mission for education. So kind of generally, I think higher education just needs to be more flexible than it currently is. And there's many ways to do that. I'm not saying open education is the only way to approach that issue, but it certainly is one way. And I think that's what I want to talk about now. So I mentioned, so that's the kind of why. So so open education as a solution to some of these kind of changing demands on higher education. The what? So, like many good higher ed research ideas, this came from a session in a pub. So I was in America with Owen de Vries from Thompson Rivers and Viv Rolfe, and we were kind of sitting there being grumpy old people moaning, saying that people in open education don't know their own past, you know. So we tend to have people who think, you know, it was invented with MOOCs, those kind of things. And Viv did some research, and so she researched open education and found that, you know, so if you just looked at this from a database, will my magic pointer work? Yeah, so you see it kind of early in the 70s, you get a peak of people talking about it, then it kind of dies off, and then you get a boost here. But these people never reference these people, it's kind of, it all stands alone. So we thought, is it just us, or is there something more here? And so I have my ex-PhD student, Katie Jordan, is a real whiz at things like citation analysis. So what she did was, we did a search for open education and a number of other key terms, and we found 20 articles, and she then stripped the references from those and fed them into a tool called Gephi, and then found the papers that those things were referencing and so on, and we did like several cycles there. And what you build up then is a map of referencing, so what articles people are talking to and linking to for each other. And this creates a network which hopefully will work here. So you see the kind of, these are initial papers, and then they're beginning to reference each other. And you see kind of clusters begin to develop. And it's very pretty. So like the kind of strength is how many people are referencing that paper, so you get a kind of indication of what are the important nodes in here. And there's an online version as well where you can kind of explore down those nodes. And then what we've done is, so the different colours are our interpretation. And broadly there are kind of 8 categories here. And our kind of grumpy old people's intuition was largely borne out really. So you see that the kind of MOOC people hardly ever reference the kind of early material about open education here. They tend to be quite sort of standalone. So I'll just quickly go through those different 8 things. So the earliest one in the network was Open Ed in classrooms. It's particularly important in America. There was something called the Plowden Report. And here this could talk about, it could be about open pedagogy, but sometimes it could also be about just open planning within the classroom space. So this one tends to sit quite sort of isolated. The next big one is distance education, so things like the Open University, where I'm from, founded in 1969, and there was a big kind of influx about the pedagogy of distance education, how to do this effectively, and also the kind of social mission, the kind of social justice of distance education, open education. And this sort of dies off a bit, that kind of explicit referencing of distance education, and in the 80s and 90s, you see e-learning come up, and this sort of bridges the gap. E-learning bridges the gap between that kind of distance learning focus and later stuff like OER. And there was also quite on my blog, I'm doing a 25 years of Edtech thing. And it's interesting when you look back at some of the kind of early e-learning stuff, how it kind of also generated a real interest in different pedagogy, people thinking, what's the best way to teach effectively this mode? So it wasn't just about using technology, but also what's the best pedagogy to make use of that. Open access, so there's a kind of little area, I'll go back there, kind of set up on the top left. It's not really about teaching. Open access is kind of very much about publishing research articles. Often it comes in sort of librarian science type journals, but it does kind of link into some of that kind of more general open educational practice and creating licenses and advantages of this stuff. Perhaps one of the biggest nodes is open educational resources. So you see this from about 2000 onwards with MIT's open courseware, and then later it turns in, sort of mutates into open textbooks, and laterly then open educational practice. So this is quite a big chunk here, and there is some link out to other stuff, but not much. MOOCs are the Johnny-come-latelys. They kind of pull up. They come in often from like computer science. Very little reference into other stuff that's gone on before that, and I think this. I mean, I'm a grumpy old man, but I've moaned about this before. But there's a kind of quite a year zero mentality about a lot of the MOOC stuff. It's like, so I'm sure for any of you who've been in distance education for a while or online education, I was rolling my eyes so often during the kind of 2012 MOOC hype that I was in danger of like having some kind of damage there. I think it's like we've invented online learning. Really, I remember like the BBC reporting kind of breathlessly like some MOOC students are getting together in face-to-face groups to support their learning. It's like, wow, what a good idea that is. Perhaps we could have an open university like that. So, but I think that kind of whole idea that, you know, this stuff was invented there. But interesting, it wasn't just, it's interesting to see that kind of citation analysis, which is kind of, we didn't know what would emerge, and it is borne out by the data there. From about the mid-2000s, you see interest in social media use, and then more latterly how academics and educators and students are using social media, and that relates to also kind of Web 2.0. So this often comes in the kind of internet studies or communication studies work, but then begins to move into the kind of open educational practice one. And so the last of them, open educational practices. So this is kind of, it's one of the most recent ones to arise, and I'll go back and I'll show the picture later, but it didn't really have a distinct area of its own. It's like the messy stuff in between everything else. And I'll come on to that later. I think that's really interesting because partly that's a result of it not being clearly well defined, and what exactly is open education practice isn't as well defined as, say, what constitutes an OER or a MOOC. But it's really focused on digital scholarly practice, how people are using technology, operating in the open, that might be through social media, or how they're using OERs to teach. So there's kind of quite a broad area. But I think it's perhaps the most interesting area now. So I said I'd talk about some of the issues. The first of all is awareness. This has always been the case. So there was a recent Commonwealth of Learning report showed that OER awareness is still the kind of major issue. So, and we did some work with the OER Research Hub, and if you ask educators where they get their, teachers where they get their online education resources from, they'll say Google, YouTube, maybe TED Talks, and all those lovely OER repositories are just never mentioned. They kind of never rank with them. So I think just knowing it's there is an issue. Sustainability has always been an issue, particularly for a lot of the OER projects. So in the UK, we had the JISC OER funding, and that kind of had a lot of small projects were funded. And then when you go back to them sort of 2 years later, they've stopped working, there's no one supporting, they didn't become part of the mainstream. So finding a model that kind of allows it to become part of normal practice is still an issue. Reward structures, so do institutions recognise or encourage open practice, whether that's through sharing OER or having an online presence? And if not, why don't they do that? And if institutions don't reward it, then why would people do it? If you go for promotion and you're being told publish in the top ranked journals, I don't care if your blog is getting 1 million hits a day or whatever, that doesn't matter for us. So it's about how we recognise it and reward it within the formal structures. There's also a kind of element of suspicion and deliberate discredit, particularly around open textbooks. You see this a lot in the US. So the commercial publishers have gone from that kind of model of saying, oh, no one cares about open textbooks, to like, oh shit, people might actually like open textbooks. So they start saying they're not as high quality as ours, and it's kind of a deliberate kind of campaign to discredit them. So a lot of research has been put in there to kind of demonstrate the efficacy of open textbooks. But also I just think many educators themselves are quite suspicious of things that are free, and I'm sure I'm not alone when I say at the Open University we have a bit of a not invented here syndrome. It's like, well, that's okay for other people to do, but we'd best create our own things, And I think the idea of good enough is quite difficult for a lot of educators to grasp. You go out looking for a resource, say, to use in your course, and this one's kind of does about 80% of what you want it to do. But it's not as good as something that I designed from scratch. But actually, that good enough might well be good enough, for you, particularly if it saves time. And so, speaking of time, I think how often have you heard educators say, "Do you know what? I just have so much spare time. I just don't know what to do with it." So it's not something you hear very often. So we tend to stick with the kind of lecture notes we know and the practice we know. And there is a kind of investment required for all of this stuff, whether that's just getting to know Creative Commons licenses, or getting to know where you can find this stuff, or learning how to adapt it, or just even like investing in things such as open educational practice, developing your own blog, or developing an online profile through Twitter and those kind of things. And I think there is, obviously there's a kind of return on investment with this stuff. I think when you first start doing it, it takes time. But I think later on, when you establish a reasonable enough profile, it begins to save you time, because you can get quick feedback and people will tell you stuff, and your network kind of works for you in a sense. But definitely there is a kind of thing about just going with what you know often. There's an issue around kind of know-how. I mean, while it's not very technological, there is a kind of a barrier often to get over with a lot of these things, particularly in terms of using OER, taking and adapting it. So at the OU, we have the Open Learn repository, which has got really high quality learning materials, but we find that people very rarely adapt them. They'll take them and use them as they are, but they won't kind of adapt them and do different things with them. Has anyone been following the Open University saga of recent weeks with our Vice-Chancellor and things? I'm sure the screenplay is coming soon. For those of you who don't know, there was a kind of there's been and he's Vice Chancellor Peter Hawkes has resigned, and so I try not to kind of publicly criticise my own institution. I don't want to be one of those people, but he said in a kind of public forum that what Open University staff do is not teaching, it's writing, and they should be bloody well teaching. And I kind of thought that was like a kind of complete betrayal of everything the OU had ever done. We'd kind of fought so long to kind of get that recognised as proper teaching, and kind of like, it's basically, you know, your vice chancellor telling you your whole career is rubbish. And I should stress that he said afterwards that isn't what he meant at all. He kind of, he was tired and he misspoke, this kind of thing. So but I think the point isn't about that so much. But I kind of went on a bit of a Twitter rampage. It was a Sunday. My daughter was saying to me, "Dad, leave it. That's enough." But I did a Twitter thread, and so like, so my top one there, and I did a transcript of the speech. So 55,000 people. This was a while ago. It's a bit more than that now. Sort of saw it, and lots of people retweeted it, and that's a really high engagement rate for Twitter. So people were kind of interacting. And then Times Higher picked up on this and ran a story in the back of it. And then the Guardian ran a story in the back of it. So I'm not responsible, okay, for my vice chancellor getting the sack. Just in case anyone else wants to employ me, you know, that's not my. But I think it kind of added into the picture, and so I think the whole kind of, so the point I'm trying to make is that your relationship with the institution and the institution's relationship with you changes very much through open practice. And I should say the OU and the vice chancellor were excellent, right? So they didn't tell me like take that down or, you know, you're in danger. They kind of behaved impeccably. But it is a different type of relationship now. You kind of have this whole idea of a personal brand, and that works for the institution as well. You know, you can be out there promoting it, and students will see it will go somewhere with an academic with a good online profile. But equally, it can be damaging. And we also kind of, perhaps a better example is during the recent strikes in the UK with UCU around the pensions and that, the kind of social media campaign really helped to overturn a lot of the narrative that was being pushed. So I think that there is a kind of, I'm not sure we know what this is like yet, actually, this kind of new relationship, and I'm sure we get it wrong either way. So although this kind of felt like good for my ego, I also felt quite bad as well, just because I don't like to criticise the OU, and I could see it kind of getting away from me in a way. So each of those retweets was like a little tiny stab to my heart. You know? So anyway, so impact. So there's the often sort of cited open access citation advantage. So journals that are published, articles that are published under an open access license generally get cited more, viewed more, downloaded more, those kind of things. And I think that's particularly true when you start thinking about the relationship with social media. I mean, there is just no point saying, hey, here's my fantastic new article, and then when you click on the link on Twitter, it says, you know, pay $50 to access this article. You know, you may as well bury it in your back garden. So it kind of has to be part of the open network. So I think that the important thing about this was, even if you don't really care about openness, but we actually care about traditional metrics such as, you know, having a good H index or whatever, then open access works for you. There's open textbook efficacy. So partly to kind of counter those claims, particularly in the US, people like David Wiley and John Hilton have looked at how effective open textbooks are, because they wanted to kind of counter that narrative, they're not as good quality, that kind of stuff, and they found, you know, pretty consistently across studies that they're as good, if not better, than kind of paid-for textbooks. And often there can often be other benefits. So particularly in the US, it's kind of very expensive to buy textbooks. So students tend to wait and see if it's worth buying one, and particularly the kind of poorer students might not invest in a book. And so they might be 2 or 3 weeks into course before they decide to buy one, and then they're kind of playing catch up. Whereas with an open textbook, the educator can assume everyone's got it from the start, and we'll just start from that basis. So that again can kind of impact performance, those kind of things. Some of the work we did with the OER Research Hub was we found much more OER use by existing and potential students than we had predicted. Sort of, although it's kind of a self-selecting sample of our surveys, about 24% of the people using open learn material were existing students of other institutions or people who wanted to study something. And I think that there's a really good study to be done there about kind of how much is that benefiting the sector as a whole. So if you're at a particular college and you have a bad lecturer in one subject, you can supplement that by finding good OER elsewhere, and it might mean you stay on that course. And equally, you know, particularly in the UK, students pay big fees to go to college, so you can't do that. So when I first started, I spent a year doing, what was I doing? Marine biology before deciding I didn't want to do marine biology, but that was okay, so I wasn't paying. That's an expensive decision to make, you know, if you're paying £9,000 a year. So the best way to find out whether you really want to do a subject is to kind of go and study some OER around that topic. There's some interesting work we begin to see around kind of expanding the curriculum. So at Delft University, for instance, they accredit MOOCs from other university, other providers, which allow them to have a much broader curriculum than they would do normally. So, okay, if you want to go and study, I don't know what courses they do, but say you want to learn Italian, we've accredited these courses over here, these MOOCs. So go there, take the course, get the credit, and that will take the exam at the end of it, and we'll count that as part of our formal credit. So you can imagine that kind of connection between several universities, and suddenly you don't need to have everyone running these very kind of expensive curriculum, but you can have quite a diverse curriculum that wouldn't be possible before. And in a study I'll talk about in a minute, we found that a lot of universities said they were using OER, and so I think there's a kind of real possibility to use it much more in course creation. So for example, at Tidewater College, they use open textbooks. And even though they're on campus, they kind of use the open textbook, then created a kind of support mechanism around that. So effectively, they created what would look like a kind of distance education, open university type course. But those kind of courses are very expensive to create. They kind of usually take us sort of a couple of years. So a small college couldn't afford to do that. But by using an open textbook as the centre of that, they could create this course. And even though students were on campus, they didn't really need to kind of get the support. And they found much higher retention rates and performance and student satisfaction. New institutional models, so things like the OER University, so a consortium of different universities around the world, all contributing open courses through the OERU platform, and they're starting to do things like offering first year free of studies. You can take these courses, they'll be accredited by UHI or Thomson Rivers, depending on the ones you take, and then you can come into formal education after that. So there's kind of a new gateway into education through that. I won't talk much about this, but I'm trying to make this a phrase, it's not working, but open flip economics. So the idea is, I think particularly around open textbooks and some of those things, you can see how you can switch the model from, instead of purchasing copyrighted material, you put that money into creating openly licensed material. So a lot of our libraries spend all their money buying journal articles, buying subscriptions to journals or buying books, and it might be a much more effective model, particularly if we kind of got a consortium going between libraries, to instead pay to produce books or produce journal articles and run open access articles, journals. So one thing I've been working on with the ICDE is this project which we've called UFAT. So if I didn't get open flip to take off as a term, I'm really not getting UFAT to take off as a term. But it stands for Open, Online, Flexible and Technology Enhanced Learning. And what they were interested in, so ICD is the International Community of Distance Education Universities. They really wanted to kind of get an idea of what people are actually doing with technology out there and how they're approaching ideas of online and open education. And they didn't want to sort of suggest that there's only one model. They wanted to kind of capture the very different types of things that people are doing. And so we kind of split up. Our kind of conceptual model had sort of three core elements. So of what universities do, they kind of create content, whether that's lectures or online material. They deliver it somehow, and then they recognise it. And within those three elements, there were kind of two dimensions we were interested in: kind of flexible and kind of openness for each of those. And so we did a survey and had responses from all around the world. On that, but it was quite an in-depth survey, and what it allowed us to do was kind of create these pretty spider diagrams, so you can that has kind of each of those dimensions on there, and from those we could create 6 different kind of models of what institutions are actually doing, and more importantly, at the end of the report, and I'll give a link to it at the end. We kind of provide a kind of step-by-step guide to say you can use this to think about your own institution. Which model would you like to be like? Where are you currently, and how might you get there? Is that me? With a business strategy. So just quickly, those are the 6 models. So UFAT at the core would be something like the OERU, kind of openness, online, flexible, is kind of that's everything they do. So they would kind of almost be a perfect nonagon on that spider diagram. Some institutions are much more interested in flexibility, kind of how can it make them be more flexible. Some are using it for a very specific purpose. They might want to meet a very particular group of students, say vocational learning. Not many are looking at it just for generating content. Quite a few interested in access, so trying to reach new students and improve access. But actually the biggest group was just almost kind of miscellaneous. So like there are several things going on around the university which are employing UFAT, but there's not one kind of big strategic model that it's feeding into. How am I doing for time? Okay. And we did we asked people what technologies they were using. And so the top three are assessment, OER, and LMS. And if you think about it, those three relate, each one of them relates very much directly to those three core principles of the conceptual model, which were content, which would be OER, delivery, LMS, and recognition, which would be online assessment. So I think that's kind of quite telling, actually. Technology gets taken up when it relates directly to a core function. And also, I think, Mark Brown was talking yesterday, like, trying to say, looking at articles they were trying to find. He said they couldn't find a good article about AI in education. You can find lots of blurby articles, lots of kind of like Wired and things, lots of things full of headlines. And I think also there's kind of, so this backs it up actually. There's almost a kind of an inverse proportion between the number of breathless headlines that technology receives and how much people are actually using it, I think. I want to put some later. I think what this sums up, I think, for me, is content's fine, and you can't do much without the content, but just having the stuff isn't enough, you know. And a lot of UNESCO put out a call for, they've got a new strategy document on OER recently, but it's all very much focused about how can we produce more content, how can we get people to access that content. And I think really it's what goes around that content that's important. So one of the problems with MOOCs was that you tend to see it's people who are already highly educated tend to be MOOC completers. So this whole idea that it's democratizing education is completely false. And so if you really want to talk about open education, you need to think about what are the support practices you put around that content as well. So where are we going? I'm going to talk about where we're going by thinking about where we've been. So here's my meme. Okay, so I wrote a book in 2011 called The Digital Scholar. And then this year, I kind of revisited it in 2000. So what's changed since 2011? I won't go into too much detail on this because digital scholarship isn't exactly the same as open practice, but there's a lot of crossover. So the model I used back then was Ernst Boyer did a study of what do scholars do. This is in 1990, so not kind of online particularly. And he broke it up into 4 categories, which were discovery, which is kind of like Genesis research, integration, application, which is kind of put it into industry or apply it to things, and teaching. And he said, actually, we should think of all 4 of those as equally important, not that one's more important than another. And what I did in the book was to think about the impact of new technologies within those 4 kind of different areas to try and map out what's happening and what the potential is, that kind of stuff. So at the time, it was a bit, what's going on. And I think this was true at the time, actually. There were quite, I can't really read that. There's quite a lot of studies done of around 2010 of educators' use of Web 2.0 technologies. And so this one, which I really should have put into black text. So Proctor, Williams and Stewart said, frequent or intensive use of Web 2 technologies is rare, and some researchers regard blogs, wikis, and other novel forms of communication as a waste of time or even dangerous. It's like some approach with caution was kind of pretty much the message in 2010, 2011. So I was interested in kind of what's changed since then. And based on nothing, more than just my own interpretation of what's happened, I came up with 5 themes. I think that, and these are a good way, I think, to think about where open education itself is going. The first of these was mainstreaming. So back in 2010 to 2011, it wasn't rare to meet an academic with a blog or a Twitter account, but it wasn't the norm, whereas that's kind of much more the norm now. And most people have had experience of using some online material. VLEs are part of a common practice, that kind of thing. So a lot of those things that were kind of new then have become part of the mainstream. And I think the interesting part in terms of open education is there's been a real shift to open, actually. We started talking much more about, not so much digital, but about open practices. And related to that, there's been a lot of work on policy development. So There's a site called Raw Map, which looks at the number of open access policies. So that's kind of become a real mainstream, and most people know about open access policies. But also there's an EU policy on OER, and lots of institutions will have policies around MOOCs and those kind of things. So there's been a real kind of shift to developing formal policies. In terms of things we talk about in digital scholarship, open scholarship, I think the big area has been kind of network identities. People like Bonnie Stewart, if you know her, writes very well on this topic. So what's it like to be an academic or a learner or an educator online, and how you develop that identity, whether that's through blogs, Twitter, social media, podcasts, whatever, you know. But also some of the downsides of that, you know, what it's like, what are people's different experiences of being online. And related to that, I think an area that's kind of really emerged is the whole idea of being critical about digital scholarship and online practice. I think certainly back then, there was so many people kind of ready to dismiss new technologies that even as someone who was kind of keen on them but wary, you felt that you had to kind of hide away any downsides, because people would jump at them and say, therefore, let us all go back to reading dusty books and never touch the internet again. So I think we kind of ignore some of those downsides, and I used to be ruled out to be the kind of the blog evangelist. Come and say blogs are great. Whereas I think now that you can't ignore those downsides now. You know, it's like, well, let's look at the US president and say, you know, you can't ignore kind of some of the stuff, you know, the use of alt-right and how a lot of stuff has become weaponized. And also I think it's the experience, people's experiences online are different. You know, I'm a white male, European male, middle-aged, and I blog about and write about a fairly non-controversial subject. That's very different from, say, a woman of color who blogs or writes about issues of race in America. That their experience online will be much different, you know, and much more abusive and full of threats and violence than mine is. So to say to everyone, you must go online, it's great, is kind of a false narrative, I think. So conclusions. I think we should think of open education as a kind of diverse set of tools. So it's not just one thing, and you don't have to do all of them. You take the bits that are most useful for you, most applicable to what you want to do. So I think we had the kind of a foundation has been set, and we often talk about digital and networked, but actually those are the kind of boring parts. I think it's the openness that builds on top of those that becomes much more interesting. And so I think, going back to that diagram, you can think of open educational practice as the kind of glue that starts to pull together all of those different areas in that citation analysis. And for me, I think that's good. So we're at the kind of interesting stage now. We've kind of done all the hard work of putting all the infrastructure in place, raising awareness, you know, getting policies in place. And I think the VLE is a kind of good example of this. I was chatting to some people yesterday. So I was the OU's VLE director in 2004, or before then, and we adopted Moodle. But the idea was always that Moodle was kind of like the base, and you would then plug in different applications as it came along. But I think for many institutions, the VLE, instead of it being a kind of stepping stone on the way to more interesting kind of e-learning, became the end point in itself, and it kind of sucked in all the resources, and people developed policy, and this kind of sediment builds up around it. But I think actually now we're at the stage where a lot of the other technologies, so people were talking about Slack, for instance, this morning, is getting easy enough to use and good enough to use that you can start building on top of the VLE and perhaps moving beyond that. So, so in terms of thinking about, you know, what you do as practitioners, you may not think that you're in the kind of open education space necessarily, but I think, you know, one of these areas is relevant to you probably. So it's thinking about which of those is relevant to you and how it can help improve your practice. So enjoy navigating the open education landscape. I've got some links come up. This is the old version on here. Oh, never mind. All photos are from Unsplash. I'll put up some more links. So I had some more links actually. So that citation analysis is there in open praxis. The UFAT report is available there. I was also told, under pain of death from Bayer and Catherine Cronin, to mention the Open Education Ireland network. And in my new version of this, I've got a link to that, but I think they gave it out yesterday. And also my Digital Scholar book and Battle for Open books are openly licensed and freely available online. So if you search for those, you can find those and read those. And that's that. Thank you.